Nick Caserio's been busy this week. What's left on his checklist before free agency gets going in the next few days? Welcome into the channel. I'm Cody Stoots. Let's talk some Texans, and let's talk about the busy week that Nick Caserio has had and how much busier it could get before free agency gets started in just a few days. Now, Dalton Schultz got the new 3-year contract. We broke that down in a video here on YouTube, which you can check out in the description down below. But Ka'imi Fairbairn gets the new contract as well. Just over $5 million a year for 3 seasons for Ka'imi Fairbairn. He's one of the most accurate kickers in football over the past 3 seasons. Now, why did I use that sample size? Because 2 seasons ago, he wasn't very accurate. He had a really bad season a couple of years ago. But the past 2 seasons, he's been very accurate. This past season, in the regular season, 1 missed field goal and 1 missed extra point. Now, we know that extra point got a little dicey there in Indianapolis, but the Texans took care of business. Of course, he missed the field goal in the playoffs. That wasn't great. But changing kickers is nauseating. It gives me an uneasy, queasy feeling in my stomach thinking about the Texans operating without Ka'imi Fairbairn. So the gap that I've talked about between Dalton Schultz and the other options at tight end, it's even wider when it comes to kickers and Ka'imi Fairbairn. Now, he couldn't get franchise tagged because of the addition to his contract when the Texans made some financial adjustments to it, but you could negotiate with him before he hits true free agency, and I was scared that the Texans were going to lose Fairbairn or at the very least find themselves paying tippity-top dollar for Ka'imi Fairbairn should he hit free agency. Nick Caserio and Fairbairn's people do a great job to keep him from hitting free agency, and the Texans lock up their kicker. So 2 out of the 3 pieces of the special teams unit that was very good last year are back. John Weeks is back. Ka'imi Fairbairn is back. Remains to be seen about Cameron Johnston, the punter. I'd bring him back as well because he's pretty good, and there's no reason to change on things that are going well when it comes to special teams. If things are good at, say, linebacker and you want to try to be great at linebacker, I certainly understand taking that swing. Same with defensive linemen or wide receivers, running back, whatever. But on special teams, if you've got it going good to maybe even great on occasion, don't change things up. Don't upset the apple cart. And when you look at the potential avenues to replacing Ka'imi Fairbairn, there weren't a lot of avenues that would make you feel warm and fuzzy about the situation if you didn't have Ka'imi Fairbairn. Sure, he missed the kick in the playoffs. That one stung. That one stinks. There's a lot of kickers that if they were the kicker last year, maybe the Texans aren't even in the playoffs in that situation. Fairbairn does a really good job. It's hard to move on from those guys. It's hard to replace those guys. So great job by the Texans to keep him around, and great job by him to not just hold the Texans hostage and try to get as much money as possible. He got a very fair contract that probably is a little bit higher if he hits the open market, similar to what Dalton Schultz did. So while these contracts aren't the best contracts in the world or super team friendly, nobody won the deal over the other person. It's fair market value for what those players are with Dalton Schultz and Ka'imi Fairbairn. So sign Schultz, big check mark for Nick Caserio on that one, and keep the kicker, big check mark there. So what's next? What else could be done before free agency arrives at the beginning of next week? Well, the big one is Jonathan Greenard. Do you go after Greenard if you're the Houston Texans and try to bring him back, get him in the fold? This is a guy where the market is definitely going to dictate that he gets a significant raise, and many of the figures that I'm sure Greenard and the Texans have discussed at this point probably go way up when he hits the open market. He has the most sacks of any free agent in all of free agency. Justin Madubuike was going to be that guy. With him, Madubuike got franchise tagged by the Baltimore Ravens, so Greenard at 13 sacks this past season has the most sacks of any free agent, and teams will line up to overpay for productive defensive linemen. Look, Javon Hargrave is a nice player, but he got a huge contract in free agency a year ago from the San Francisco 49ers. Now, that's a defensive tackle versus a defensive end, but teams love having pressure off the edge as well. You look at some of these other names in recent years in free agency, like DeMontre Jones, he didn't have anywhere near the statistical excellence that Jonathan Greenard had. He got a big contract last year. Greenard's looking at least, if he hits the open market, $15 million a year, maybe $16, $17 million a year. I would be shocked if that's not the average annual value for him. In fact, I think about to Trey Hendrickson, one of the players who is in a similar situation to Greenard, where he was productive, and then the final year before free agency, boom, he exploded, had a big year. A contract similar to Hendrickson's, which is, I don't know, about 4 years, $60 million. That feels like something that Jonathan Greenard could very easily ask for and very easily find come free agency time. So talking with Greenard in these final hours before free agency hits, paying him enough to the point where he doesn't hit the open market and it doesn't get even more expensive to replace him, that's where it gets really critical for the Houston Texans if they feel like they have to do that. There's not a lot of great options to replace Jonathan Greenard from a defensive end standpoint. I would think the Texans, if they can't get Greenard, they would shift their focus into spending some money at the defensive tackle position, increasing that, and then maybe leaving the end position for a bargain player, a middle-of-the-cost level veteran, or perhaps a rookie. The Texans have the 23rd overall pick in the first round and a couple of other picks in the next few rounds as well. Now, while it doesn't sound great to say a rookie or a second or third rounder starting opposite Will Anderson, if you have a really nasty defensive tackle duo with, say, Malik Collins and Chris Jones from Kansas City coming over, or Malik Collins and Christian Wilkins from the Miami Dolphins coming over, it becomes a little easier to understand that defensive end position opposite Will Anderson being held down by a rookie or a mid-level veteran or something of that nature. But if the Texans want to make the investment in Greenard and both sides can get to a Schultz-esque or a Kaimi-esque contract where, hey, maybe you save a couple of bucks as the Texans by not having him hit the open market at bidding against somebody, but the player also gets to stick around with familiarity, a team that he was successful with, a defense that he was successful with. But at the same time, if I'm Jonathan Greenard and I'm thinking about my situation and I've made the money that I've made up to this point and I'm staring down a huge, not only yearly raise, but an overall contract, it'd be very hard for me to not at least listen to what these other teams have to say, to not at least listen to what these other teams are going to offer, what they have in mind for me when it comes to their defense. It'd be very hard if I was Jonathan Greenard to not test free agency and see what's out there, because you have to imagine that the Houston Texans, whatever they would get to prior to free agency, that would be there for Greenard if he didn't find what he wanted out there in free agency. Maybe a few bucks less because the Texans will need to make a move here or there in the immediate opening of free agency. But you got to think, if Greenard doesn't find what he wants out there, the Texans deal would still be relatively close to what they're talking about, say, now, ahead of free agency getting going. So that's the big question for Nick Caserio. If I was the Texans, if I felt like I could get a comfortable contract done with Greenard, I'd go about that. I wouldn't overpay for Jonathan Greenard. And if I was Greenard's side, I'd be trying to hit free agency, see what everybody wants to pay. And I don't know, Chicago, maybe Jonathan Greenard and Montez Sweat as the defensive ends up in Chicago. Heck, anybody that's got a defensive end opening would be interested in talking to Jonathan Greenard and seeing if they could make the money work come free agency. So Greenard, I would tell him, you got to test free agency and do some work here and listen to some other teams if the Texans aren't coming correct with some big money prior to the start of free agency. Then there's a little bit step down from the commitment, but it kind of showcases where you might want to go ahead of free agency if you make that deal. And it's bring back Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary was a productive running back for the team last year, started as the backup, finished as the starter, over 1,000 yards rushing. The receiving wasn't as good as it has been in his career, but the Texans overall didn't throw the ball to the running backs as much as I would have expected they were going to last year. But Singletary was a nice piece that took over as a starter. Do you want him to be the main starter for this team? I'd be okay with it as long as there's something else with him. And signing Devin Singletary before free agency gets started, that may tip the Texans' hands and show you that they're not chasing the top of the market running backs like, say, Saquon Barkley, who the Texans are a betting favorite to land, according to some odds makers, or Josh Jacobs, who will be tough to pry away from the Las Vegas Raiders, or heck, even Derrick Henry, who, while he's older, has a lot of carries, still carries a heavier cost than some of these other free agents. If they sign Devin Singletary ahead of free agency starting next week, it feels like the Texans are showing us through their actions that they'd probably be looking for a running mate with Devin Singletary. Pun intended, because they're running backs. A running mate, a tandem, a duo with Devin Singletary. What I do know is re-signing Singletary is not enough for the running back room. So if they make the move to bring him back before free agency gets started, they need to be chasing a complement, a dynamic duo partner for Devin Singletary come free agency. And I would think that an investment in Singletary ahead of the start next week would mean that the top of the market is not where the Texans are going to shop. But you could convince me that, say, Devin Singletary and DeAndre Swift would be a nice running back room. You could convince me that Devin Singletary and Tony Pollard from the Dallas Cowboys would be a nice running back room and a good tandem to work with for 2024 and maybe even 2025 if you make that commitment with those players. So a couple of checks off the checklist in Schultz and Kaimi Fairbairn, and then a couple of questions that the Texans have to sort of answer and figure out over the next couple of days before free agency gets started next week. And we're talking about, boom, big money for Jonathan Greenard, maybe some competition for Devin Singletary, and then the number of other free agents that the Texans have. Blake Cashman, Sheldon Rankins, Steven Nelson, a bunch of other depth pieces and players like that. The Texans will have to make some decisions on them as well. I wouldn't prioritize those players here in the final few days. Maybe you let the market come to you on depth players or key backups or first guy on the depth charts, stuff like that. You let the market kind of come to you. Don't overthink it, because you can't just bring back everybody from 2023 and hope that that makes you a lot better in 2024. It's going to need to be some spots. We need to be chasing those upgrades. It'll be fascinating to watch. We'll have it all covered here on the YouTube channel, as well as Houston football, where I do all my writing about the Houston Texans. www.houfootball.com. The link is in the description down below. Subscribe now, just $7 a month, and you get everything on the site. And if you sign up for a whole year, I'll give you 2 months for free. And if you sign up now for a whole year, that's going to get you all of training camp when it gets here. That's going to get you all of next year's season, all of the Senior Bowl next year, all of the scouting combine next year. You're going to get a lot of stuff if you sign up right now. No better time than to head over to Houston football and get signed up. Just $7 a month. I'll make it worth your money. I want it to make it worth your time watching this video. So if it is worth your time, throw me a thumbs up on the channel. Subscribe so you don't miss anything about the Houston Texans that we talk about here on the channel. And as always, I appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And I can't wait till we talk Texans again soon.